image a sealed document from the late Queen's private archive just changed everything inside Buckingham Palace. Yesterday morning, Prince Edward's high-profile legal team walked into the King's private office with an enforceable inheritance demand. For 3 long years, King Charles fiercely denied his youngest brother these massive family assets. Now, the lawyers have confirmed Edward legally owns them, and the cornered king cannot do a single thing to stop it. Let's get into the full story. The sealed document on the king's desk. The leather folder sat directly on the center of the mahogany desk. It arrived at 10 o'clock sharp on a Tuesday morning. King Charles did not open it immediately. He finished his morning tea first. The courier had not been a standard palace messenger. It was a senior partner from a top-tier law firm based in Lincoln's Inn. The envelope bore a heavy red wax seal. It was the private emblem of the late Queen Elizabeth. When Charles finally broke the seal, his expression changed completely. His private secretary stood near the window, waiting for the daily signature workflow. The king read the first page twice. He did not speak for a full minute. The document was a formal legal notice. It was not a request from a sibling. It was a binding assertion of rights. Prince Edward's legal representatives had officially filed a claim. They were targeting a specific pocket of the crown's private wealth. The timing of this delivery was calculated perfectly. The palace was already dealing with intense public scrutiny. Charles had spent months finalizing his vision for a streamlined monarchy. He wanted fewer working royals. He wanted lower operational costs. He wanted total central control over all royal properties and funds. This new document threatened to shatter that plan. It laid out a specific sequence of transfers. These transfers involved land, historical assets, and private revenues. For 3 years, the public believed Edward was entirely compliant. He had accepted his new title with a quiet smile. He had attended every necessary state function. He never complained to the press about his reduced public role. Behind that quiet exterior, something else was happening. Edward had spent those 36 months working with estate lawyers. They dug deep into the private archives of Windsor and Balmoral. They found exactly what they needed. The core of the dispute rests on a distinction few people understand. There is a massive difference between the crown estate and the sovereign's private wealth. The crown estate belongs to the reigning monarch only by virtue of the throne. It cannot be sold or carved up. But the private wealth is entirely different. This includes personal investments, private estates like Sandringham, and massive collections of art and jewelry. Queen Elizabeth had total control over these personal funds. She could leave them to whoever she pleased. Charles believed he inherited absolute authority over these private holdings. He viewed himself as the sole trustee of the family fortune. He used this perceived power to squeeze his younger siblings. He cut allowances. He demanded detailed expense reports. He even suggested that some family members move out of their long-term residences. He wanted everyone to depend entirely on his personal approval. The document on his desk changed the legal reality instantly. It contained a photocopied codicil from 1998. It carried the signatures of Queen Elizabeth and Prince Philip. It also carried the signature of a former Lord Chancellor. This was not a casual family agreement written on palace stationery. It was a bulletproof legal instrument. It explicitly carved out a massive segment of the private estate. It designated these assets for Edward and his direct descendants. The immediate financial impact is staggering. We are talking about tens of millions of pounds in independent revenues. This money does not come from the taxpayer-funded sovereign grant. It comes from commercial land leases in the south of England. Charles had already integrated these specific leases into his upcoming budget. He planned to use the funds to upgrade the energy efficiency of Buckingham Palace. Now, that money is legally frozen. The king's private secretary immediately called the palace legal team. Within 20 minutes, 3 attorneys arrived at the private apartments. They did not offer comforting words. They looked at the signatures on the document and nodded. The legal framework was ironclad. Queen Elizabeth had anticipated future family friction. She knew how succession worked. She knew that older brothers often marginalize younger ones once the crown changes hands. She took deliberate steps to prevent that from happening to her youngest son. This sets off an immediate crisis within the household staff. Courtiers are quietly whispering about the precedent this sets. If Edward can successfully challenge the king's financial dominance, others might try. Prince Andrew is currently fighting to keep his home at the Royal Lodge. He is watching this development very closely. If Edward's lawyers establish that the late Queen's private wishes override the reigning king's current directives, the entire palace hierarchy could collapse. The document also details a specific inventory of historic artifacts. These are not items displayed in the public galleries of Windsor Castle. They are private family heirlooms. They include rare paintings gifted to Prince Philip by foreign heads of state. They also include a significant collection of vintage driving carriages and equestrian equipment. Charles had intended to catalog these items for a public exhibition. Edward's lawyers have made it clear that these items belong exclusively to their client. The tension in the room was palpable as the lawyers explained the options. Charles could fight this in a private tribunal. That would require hiring external judges. It would risk leaking highly sensitive financial data to the public. The alternative was equally unappealing. The king would have to sign a formal capitulation. He would have to publicly acknowledge that his younger brother holds an independent source of power and wealth. Edward's legal team gave the palace a strict deadline. They did not grant weeks for reflection. They demanded a formal response within 7 business days. If the palace refused to acknowledge the claim, the lawyers threatened to take the matter to the High Court. A public lawsuit between the king and his brother would destroy the image of stability Charles has worked so hard to project. The king stared down at the red wax pieces scattered across his desk blotter. The small fragments of wax looked like drops of ink on the green leather. For years, he believed he held all the cards. He believed the crown gave him absolute veto power over his family's lives. He was wrong. His mother had left behind a hidden legal minefield. Edward had just stepped directly onto the detonator. This sudden move reveals a side of Prince Edward the public has never seen. He is no longer the quiet, deferential theater enthusiast who avoids conflict. He is acting with the precision of a seasoned corporate executive. He chose his moment perfectly. He waited until the king's administrative reforms were fully committed. He waited until Charles could not easily restructure his financial plans without massive public embarrassment. The private secretary picked up the folder to take it down to the solicitor's office. The heavy paper rustled in the quiet room. Charles walked over to the window and looked out at the palace gardens. The lawns were perfectly manicured, representing complete order and control. But inside the walls, the structure was fracturing. The quietest prince had just delivered a masterpiece of legal warfare. The king was officially on notice. Can the palace find a loophole in a document signed by 3 of the most powerful legal minds of the previous century? Or will Charles be forced to hand over the keys to an empire within an empire? The answers sit inside a secure vault in Lincoln's Inn, and Edward's lawyers are holding the only key. Why the quietest brother waited 3 long years? A black town car pulled up to the security gates of Bagshot Park on a rainy evening in November. Prince Edward sat in the back seat, holding a green plastic folder. Inside were 30 pages of bank statements and property deeds spanning 2 decades. He did not look at his phone. He watched the windshield wipers clear the heavy rain. This was 2 years ago, right in the middle of King Charles's first major administrative audit. Edward was returning from a tense meeting at Clarence House, where his personal staff budget had just been cut by 25%. That meeting set a specific chain of events into motion. Charles had sat across a small table and explained his new financial reality. The king used a blue fountain pen to cross out 3 staff positions on Edward's household ledger. One was a senior equerry who had managed Edward's charity schedule for 15 years. Charles stated that the sovereign grant could no longer subsidize minor royal operations. Edward did not argue. He gathered his papers, thanked his brother, and left the room. The public saw nothing of this friction. On television, Edward remained the picture of absolute loyalty. He stood on the balcony of Buckingham Palace during state visits. He wore his military uniforms with precision. He traveled to Edinburgh to fulfill his duties as the new duke. Royal commentators praised him for being the dependable sibling who never caused trouble. They contrasted his quiet dedication with the loud public departures of Prince Harry and the ongoing legal messes of Prince Andrew. But silence is not compliance. It can be a strategy. Edward knew that an immediate protest would look weak. It would make him look greedy to a public struggling with a high cost of living. If he fought Charles in the first year of the reign, the king would simply use his new sovereign authority to crush the rebellion. Charles had the momentum of his coronation behind him. He had the full backing of the treasury. Edward needed time to find the exact structural flaw in his brother's new regime. He started by looking into the specific promises made during his wedding in 1999. When Edward married Sophie Rhys-Jones, Buckingham Palace issued an official press release. It stated that Edward would eventually receive the Duke of Edinburgh title. This was his father's explicit wish. But the statement omitted a crucial detail. It did not mention the financial package attached to that specific title. Prince Philip had spent 50 years building up an independent network of investments tied directly to his Scottish dukedom. When Prince Philip died, Charles inherited everything as the eldest son. This included the titles and the initial administration of the estate. When Charles became king, those assets technically merged with the crown. For months, Edward's requests for an update on his father's specific trusts went unanswered. The palace financial office kept delaying the meetings. They claimed they were still sorting out the complex tax liabilities of the late Queen's estate. Edward hired a specialized firm of probate solicitors in London. They did not use the traditional palace law firms. They went to an independent firm that specialized in high net worth estate disputes. The primary investigator was a former land registry official who knew exactly how the duchy systems operated. They spent 18 months tracking the movement of specific funds between 1965 and 1995. They discovered a series of private transactions involving land in Surrey and Berkshire. Prince Philip had quietly bought several parcels of commercial real estate using his own personal wealth. He did not use crown money. He registered these properties under a unique corporate structure. This structure was designed to bypass the traditional inheritance rules of the royal family. The goal was to create a permanent, self-sustaining fund for his youngest son. Charles was completely unaware of the depth of this research. He was focused on his public image as a modernizer. He announced plans to open larger sections of Balmoral and Windsor to paying tourists. He wanted to run the royal family like a highly efficient corporate enterprise. In his mind, Edward was simply an employee who would accept whatever salary was offered. The king's advisors assumed Edward lacked the stomach for a real fight. The turning point occurred during a family dinner at Sandringham. Charles mentioned a plan to repurpose several agricultural buildings near Edward's estate. He wanted to convert them into commercial rental properties managed directly by the Crown Estate Commissioners. This move would have stripped Edward of his local management rights. It would have placed Crown employees directly on his doorstep. Edward listened to the plan, took a sip of water, and changed the subject to the upcoming Commonwealth Games. The next morning, Edward authorized his lawyers to draft the first formal warning letter. They did not send it through the standard internal palace mail. They delivered it to the king's private solicitor via recorded courier. The letter did not contain emotional appeals about family loyalty or their father's memory. It listed dates, land registry numbers, and specific financial totals. It proved that Charles had been accidentally spending money that did not belong to the crown. This creates a massive accounting nightmare for the palace. If Charles has to return 3 years of rental income from those specific lands, it will disrupt the entire royal budget. The palace financial team has already allocated those funds for upcoming building repairs. Removing that money now creates an immediate deficit. The king cannot easily ask Parliament for more money to cover a private family dispute. The mystery deepens when you look at the exact wording of Prince Philip's final trust documents. There is a clause that explicitly mentions the concept of a sovereign default. Philip knew that a future monarch might try to claw back these private assets. He inserted a penalty provision. If the reigning monarch attempts to seize or interfere with these specific funds, the entire trust automatically transfers to an independent offshore board of trustees. This would remove the wealth from the United Kingdom entirely, placing it completely outside the king's legal reach. Charles now realizes he cannot simply order his brother to drop the matter. If he pushes too hard, the offshore clause triggers. That would mean millions of pounds leaving the country, causing a massive public relations disaster. The king's legal team spent 48 hours trying to find a flaw in Philip's corporate structure. They found nothing. The late Duke had built a perfect financial fortress around his favorite child. Edward's 3-year delay was a deliberate pacing strategy. He waited until the king's new administration was fully locked into its long-term financial commitments. He waited until Charles had signed the new agreements with the Treasury regarding the sovereign grant percentages. By waiting for this exact moment, Edward ensured that Charles had no room to maneuver. The king cannot rewrite his budget without exposing the entire dispute to the National Audit Office. The quiet brother had played the long game. He endured the public snubs. He watched his staff get reduced. He smiled for the cameras during the coronation and the state openings of Parliament. He let everyone believe he was powerless. Now, he stands as the only family member who has successfully blocked the king's path. The green folder he held in the back of that town car has turned into a document that could redefine royal financial power forever. The 60-year promise. Written in invisible ink, Prince Philip sat at his writing desk in Sandringham, clicked open a vintage fountain pen, and signed a thick piece of parchment dated March 14, 1963. Two trusted naval officers witnessed the signature before the paper went into a steel lockbox. This document remained untouched for exactly 60 years. It was not stored in the royal archives at Windsor Castle. Instead, it stayed inside the private vaults of a family bank in Fleet Street. Edward's legal team retrieved this original parchment just 4 months ago. The contents of that 1963 document completely reshaped the modern understanding of royal inheritance. The text outlines a specific agreement between Prince Philip and Queen Elizabeth regarding their family planning. At that time, the couple had already decided to expand their family after a 10-year gap. Prince Andrew had been born in 1960. Prince Edward would arrive 1 year after this document was signed, in March of 1964. Philip wanted a guaranteed financial safeguard for his unborn youngest son before he even entered the world. The legal facts of the case reveal a complex historical arrangement. In 1952, Queen Elizabeth ascended the throne, making her the sole owner of the vast crown lands. Prince Philip, however, held no constitutional right to that wealth. He depended entirely on a parliamentary allowance. To build his own independent fortune, he began aggressively investing in commercial timber yards, manufacturing hubs, and agricultural properties across Norfolk and Surrey. He used his personal salary and a series of private inheritances from his European relatives to fund these purchases. This private network of investments grew significantly over the next few decades. By the late 1970s, Philip's personal portfolio generated hundreds of thousands of pounds each year. He did not reinvest this money back into the general royal pool. He directed his accountants to deposit the funds into a separate entity called the Southern Counties Trust. The 19th century legal loophole he used allowed a member of the royal family to hold private wealth completely shielded from the oversight of the Treasury. Tension over this arrangement began brewing during the early years of King Charles's tenure as Prince of Wales. Charles was studying the finances of the Duchy of Cornwall. He realized that several prime commercial properties on the borders of his estate actually belonged to his father's private trust. Charles wanted to merge these border properties into the duchy to increase his own annual yield. Philip refused the request during a heated argument at Windsor. He told Charles that the Southern Counties Trust was entirely off-limits. The reason for this refusal was a well-kept palace secret. Philip knew that the British Constitution heavily favors the firstborn son. The Prince of Wales automatically receives the immense wealth of the Duchy of Cornwall. The reigning monarch receives the Duchy of Lancaster and the Crown Estate. Younger siblings get nothing but a temporary allowance that can be revoked by Parliament or the sovereign at any moment. Philip viewed this system as inherently unfair to his younger children, particularly Edward, who showed little interest in commercial corporate climbing. This brings us to the core mystery of the current legal battle. How did Philip ensure that a private trust signed in 1963 could successfully override the statutory powers of a reigning king in the 21st century? The answer lies in the specific legal structure of the Duke of Edinburgh title itself. When King George VI created the dukedom for Philip in 1947, the letter's patent included a unique inheritance clause. It stated that the title would revert to the crown upon Philip's death, but the physical property assets attached to the name could be assigned independently by the holder through a private deed of gift. Charles believed that because the title officially reverted to the crown when Philip died in 2021, all associated property assets automatically became his personal property as king. He acted on this assumption immediately. He took control of the keys to several historic storage facilities in London. He reassigned the leases on 3 lucrative commercial farms in Berkshire. He assumed the matter was settled because he held the sovereign authority. Edward's lawyers shattered that assumption by presenting the original 1963 deed of gift. The document proves that Philip had already legally severed the financial assets from the physical title 60 years ago. He transferred the ownership of the land and the revenue streams to the Southern Counties Trust, naming Edward as the sole beneficiary upon his reaching the age of majority. The title of Duke of Edinburgh could go back to the crown, but the money remained locked in Edward's name. The financial reality of this discovery is causing immense panic within the palace legal department. The revenue from those Berkshire farms alone amounts to nearly £2 million annually. Charles has already spent a significant portion of that income on administrative overhauls at Sandringham. If the High Court enforces the 1963 deed, Charles will have to pay his brother back every single penny out of his own pocket. The document also includes an explicit clause regarding the permanent residency rights of Edward's family. It states that the beneficiary of the trust holds a lifetime lease on any property purchased by the trust assets, independent of royal approval. This directly protects Edward's tenure at Bagshot Park. Charles cannot evict his brother, he cannot raise the rent, and he cannot force him to downsize to a smaller cottage on the Windsor estate. This sets up a dangerous legal precedent that threatens the entire modern restructuring of the royal family. If private deeds from deceased royals can bind the current sovereign, the king's power is severely diminished. Charles wanted to be an absolute manager who could move family members around like pieces on a chessboard. He wanted to reduce the number of active royals to save money and project an image of a lean, modern monarchy. His father's invisible ink has completely blocked that ambition. Princess Anne is reportedly acting as a mediator between her two brothers. She visited Buckingham Palace last Thursday to meet with Charles before traveling down to Bagshot Park to speak with Edward. Anne understands the danger of a public legal war. She knows that if the contents of the 1963 trust become public through a court proceeding, the taxpayer will see exactly how much private wealth the family has hidden away in Fleet Street banks. This exposure could severely damage public support for the monarchy during a time of economic instability. Edward remains resolute. He showed his sister the original parchment with their father's bold signature. He explained that this is not about challenging Charles's role as king. It is about honoring their father's explicit wishes to protect the younger branch of the family. Edward has spent his entire life being the compliant, quiet prince who stepped aside for his older brothers. He believes that backing down now would be a betrayal of the one parent who took concrete steps to secure his future. The mystery now shifts to another folder discovered in the same Fleet Street vault. Edward's lawyers have hinted that the 1963 document is only the first phase of their claim. There is a second envelope, signed by Queen Elizabeth in 1999, that deals with the personal jewelry and art collections of the late Queen Mother. If that document follows the same legal logic, Edward may lay claim to a significant portion of the royal art collection currently on display in London. Charles finds himself in an impossible position. He can capitulate quietly, handing over millions in revenue and admitting that his father outmaneuvered him from the grave. Or he can fight his brother in a closed-door tribunal, risking a massive internal rift that could tear the working core of the family apart. The green leather blotter on his desk remains covered in legal briefs, but the 60-year-old parchment from Fleet Street is the only document that truly matters. What happened behind closed doors at Bagshot Park? Sophie, the Duchess of Edinburgh, stood by the tall sash window of the library at Bagshot Park, watching a delivery van exit through the iron security gates. It was 3 o'clock on a cold Thursday afternoon last month. On the long oak table behind her sat 3 matching cardboard boxes filled with blue legal ledger books. These were the internal accounts of the Bagshot estate dating back to 1999. Edward sat at the end of the table, writing notes with a black rollerball pen on a legal pad. The scene inside the room was far from the polished image of royal relaxation usually presented to the public. This was a war room. 2 junior partners from the Lincoln's Inn law firm sat opposite the prince, surrounded by open binders, property surveys, and land tax receipts. The lawyers had spent the last 48 hours cross-referencing every penny the Edinburgh family had personally invested in the property against the official maintenance grants provided by the Crown Estate over the past 27 years. The facts of the Bagshot Park lease are central to understanding why this meeting took place. In 1999, following their wedding, Edward and Sophie signed a 50-year lease on the 120-room mansion. The property sits on 51 acres of prime crown land just 11 miles south of Windsor. Under the original terms, Edward paid a one-off upfront sum to secure the tenancy, but the agreement required him to fund all internal structural renewals out of his own pocket. Over nearly 3 decades, those structural renewals added up to a massive financial investment. Edward and Sophie spent over £3 million of their private inheritance money to repair the Victorian brickwork, replace the leaking lead roofs, and upgrade the ancient heating infrastructure. They did this under the explicit assumption that the property would remain a secure asset for their children, Lady Louise and James, the Earl of Wessex. The tension escalated when King Charles sent a formal palace surveyor to Bagshot Park without warning. The surveyor arrived with a directive from the Duchy of Lancaster Administrative Office. The king's plan was straightforward. He wanted to split the 51-acre estate into 3 separate parcels. The main mansion would be leased out to an international luxury hotel group on a commercial basis. Edward and Sophie would be moved to a smaller, modern cottage on the Windsor estate, similar to the property Prince Harry and Meghan Markle vacated. Charles justified this move under his strict code of royal modernization. He told his advisors that a non-working royal household did not require a 120-room mansion maintained at the periphery of the crown's budget. The king's team believed that since the crown estate held the ultimate freehold of the land, Edward would have no choice but to comply with a relocation order. They expected the same quiet compliance that Edward had shown throughout his entire public career. But the atmosphere inside the library at Bagshot Park that afternoon was anything but compliant. Sophie refused to let her family be forced out to make way for a commercial hotel venture. She pointed to a specific stack of receipts from 2004, which detailed a complete overhaul of the estate's stable blocks. That project had been funded entirely by a private cash gift from Queen Elizabeth. The late Queen had specifically noted in her personal diary that the stables were being converted to ensure the long-term independent equestrian training of her grandchildren. Edward's lawyers found the ultimate defense buried within those 2004 transaction records. They discovered that when Queen Elizabeth provided the funds for the stable conversion, she signed a concurrent waiver as the head of the Crown estate. This waiver explicitly stated that any capital improvements funded by the private purse of the sovereign or the lessee would automatically extend the lease protection by an additional 25 years for each major project completed. This discovery changed the legal math completely. The original 50-year lease, signed in 1999, was scheduled to run until 2049. With the capital improvement waivers factored in, the lease is now legally locked until 2074. Edward and his heirs hold an unbreakable right of occupancy that extends well past the lifetime of King Charles and Prince William. The king cannot evict them, and he cannot alter the boundaries of the 51 acres without committing a direct breach of contract. The mystery that remained was whether the king's advisors would try to bypass this property lock by attacking Edward's personal income instead. Charles held the power to reduce the operational allowances that Edward used to pay his household staff and security detail. If the king made it too expensive to live at Bagshot Park, he could effectively starve his brother out of the property without ever breaking the lease. The lawyers resolved that mystery by producing the second part of their legal strategy. They pulled out a confidential financial agreement signed between Prince Philip and the Duchy of Cornwall in 1985. At that time, Charles was expanding his organic farming ventures, and he needed a significant capital loan from his father to purchase land near Highgrove. Philip agreed to the loan, but he attached a reciprocal clause that remained dormant for 40 years. The clause stated that if the Duchy of Cornwall or the reigning sovereign ever reduced the customary financial provisions for the younger branches of the family below the 1985 baseline adjusted for inflation, the outstanding balance of the Highgrove loan would become instantly repayable to Prince Philip's chosen beneficiary. That beneficiary is Prince Edward. If Charles cuts Edward's household budget by even a single pound, he triggers a legal demand for a £12 million cash repayment from the duchy funds. When the senior attorney explained this clause to Sophie, she closed her binder and smiled. The financial trap was perfectly set. Prince Philip had anticipated every single administrative move his eldest son would make decades before he ever took the throne. He knew Charles would want to consolidate wealth around the direct line of succession, and he used Charles's own past financial dependencies to protect his youngest son's future. The meeting at Bagshot Park concluded at 6 o'clock as the rain began to clear. Edward signed 4 copies of the formal legal response drafted by his attorneys. These documents were not filled with emotional pleas about family unity. They were cold, precise, and backed by 5 decades of undeniable financial receipts. The The lawyers packed the papers back into the cardboard boxes and left for their London offices. The private showdown inside those closed doors shows that the battle for the crown's wealth is no longer fought with royal decrees. It is fought in the fine print of lease agreements and decades-old loan clauses. Edward and Sophie had spent 3 years letting the palace believe they were cornered. In reality, they were simply waiting until they had verified every single signature on the documents that protect their home. The response from Buckingham Palace arrived via a brief text message to Edward's private secretary later that evening. The King's administrative team requested an immediate suspension of the surveyor's orders while they reviewed the new findings. The initial attempt to downsize the Edinburgh family had failed before it even started. The quietest royals had successfully turned their country home into an unassailable fortress, and the king was left holding a massive bill for an argument he could not win. The panic, spreading through the palace corridors. A sharp rap on the door of the palace legal department at 8 o'clock on a Friday morning woke the senior staff to an immediate crisis. The king's principal private solicitor sat at a long table covered in cold coffee cups and printouts of the Duchy of Lancaster Charter. 2 senior advisors from the Treasury were already present, having arrived by private car from Whitehall just 30 minutes earlier. The 7-day deadline issued by Prince Edward's legal team was ticking away, and the palace administrative machinery had no viable response. Clerks pulled heavy leather-bound ledger books from the basement archives beneath Buckingham Palace. These books contained the private estate records of Queen Elizabeth from the mid-1990s. The legal team checked every transaction to see if other hidden waivers or reciprocal loan clauses existed within the family accounts. They looked for an escape hatch, but every document they opened only confirmed the strength of Edward's position. The specific fear gripping the palace hierarchy was the terrifying precedent this case sets. For over a century, the reigning sovereign has operated under the assumption of absolute financial dominance within the family. The king speaks, the treasury allocates, and the junior royals comply. If Edward can use private contracts and 50-year-old deeds to successfully defy a direct command from the king, that absolute dominance is gone forever. This realization sent shockwaves through the other royal households. Over at the Royal Lodge in Windsor Great Park, Prince Andrew watched this development closely. Andrew has spent over 2 years resisting pressure from King Charles to vacate his 30-room mansion. The moment Andrew learned that Edward's lawyers had successfully frozen the king's property plans, he immediately requested copies of the legal framework to see if he could apply the same strategy to his own defense. The panic quickly spread to the Duchy of Cornwall offices in London. Prince William's administrative team realized that their own long-term financial projections were in jeopardy. The Duchy of Cornwall relies on stable, predictable commercial land revenues to fund William's public work and personal household. If Prince Philip's 1985 Highgrove loan clause is triggered by any cuts to Edward's budget, William's estate will be forced to cough up a £12 million cash repayment almost instantly. This would wipe out a massive chunk of the duchy's liquid assets and force William to halt several of his high-profile charitable initiatives. Tension between the king and Princess Anne reached an all-time high during a closed-door meeting at Clarence House that afternoon. Anne had spent the previous 48 hours trying to broker a quiet compromise between her 2 brothers. She proposed a middle ground where Edward would retain Bagshot Park for his lifetime, but agree to surrender a portion of the southern commercial land revenues to the Crown estate. Edward's lawyers rejected the proposal out of hand. When Anne reported this back to Charles, the king's reaction was one of immense frustration. He viewed Edward's refusal as a direct act of insubordination during a highly sensitive period for the family. A public legal battle over private commercial estates would look incredibly damaging on the front pages of the national newspapers. It would portray the family as an argumentative corporation fighting over hidden wealth rather than a dedicated institution of public service. The legal team spent the afternoon reviewing the specific statutory powers of the Crown Estate Commissioners to see if they could launch a countersuit. They looked into an old 1961 Act of Parliament that governs how Crown lands are managed. They hoped to find a clause that would allow the sovereign to declare any private lease null and void if the land was required for urgent state purposes. The investigation yielded nothing. The 1961 Act explicitly protects the rights of existing tenants, provided they have fulfilled their maintenance obligations. Edward's £3 million investment in Bagshot Park made him an unassailable tenant under the law. By 5 o'clock, the head of the palace legal team walked out of the briefing room and instructed his secretary to schedule an urgent meeting with Edward's lead attorney for the following Monday morning. There would be no aggressive countersuit. There would be no royal decree overriding the claim. The palace was officially entering a phase of damage control. They were going to the negotiating table from a position of total weakness. The quiet prince had completely outmaneuvered the entire palace apparatus without ever making a public statement, and the corridors of power were left echoing with the quiet realization that the king's authority had found its absolute limit. A monarchy fractured at the very worst moment. The final conference call between Buckingham Palace and Edward's legal team concluded at noon on Monday. King Charles sat alone in his study, looking at a single sheet of paper. It was the formal concession framework. The king had no choice but to sign it. Launching a high court battle would expose the royal family's private financial records to public scrutiny. During a time of immense national economic strain and intense personal health challenges for senior royals, a public war over millions of pounds would be catastrophic for the institution. By signing the document, Charles formally acknowledged that the late Queen's private wishes and Prince Philip's 1963 trust take absolute legal precedence. The Crown Estate officially dropped its demands to reclaim the land parcels around Bagshot Park. The commercial revenues from the southern estates remain locked under Edward's control, securing an independent financial empire for his branch of the family. The quietest prince had successfully stood his ground, mapping out a definitive victory using the precise legal tools left behind by his parents. This sudden fracture leaves the palace in a highly vulnerable position. Charles's long-term vision of a highly streamlined, central monarchy has suffered a definitive blow. He cannot freely redistribute crown properties or slash the budgets of non-working royals without facing immediate, legally binding consequences. The hidden clauses inside Philip's estate planning have established an unbreakable barrier around Edward's household. The balance of internal power has shifted dramatically, proving that even a reigning king cannot rewrite history when the fine print is ironclad. The lines have been deeply drawn inside the palace walls. King Charles wanted absolute control over a downsized royal family, but Prince Edward's lawyers just proved that the late Queen's final wishes cannot be overridden by a crown. This silent rebellion changes the family's financial power dynamic for generations to come. What do you think about Edward's sudden, aggressive legal move against the king? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If you want to stay ahead of every major royal update, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell right now.